Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of The Modern Mind. This time, I'm sorry to disappoint, but it's just me. So it's Mental Health Awareness Week and I thought I would give a bit more context, a bit more background on myself as an individual against the story that you've probably heard already. I've shared a few times before on my personal YouTube channel around my experience with depression and my suicide attempt in May of 2016. But I thought I'd put a bit more flesh on the bones, a bit more context, just in the hope that it might allow some people to better understand the position that I was in, because they might be able to reflect on it or resonate with it from a position of their own. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run through the sort of full in-depth story, and I'm sure those of you that have heard my story before are sick and tired of hearing the details, but given that a fair few might be new to my channel, might be new to hearing about the things that I've got to in the past as a result of the Roman Kemp documentary or more recent things that I've got up to, there's no harm in sharing it again, because the whole point of Mental Health Awareness Week is to do exactly that. It's trying to encourage awareness and, more importantly, encourage action. And if any of the story that I can share can encourage action in any way, then I will count doing this video as an enormous success. So without any further ado, I'm going to run through the detail of my own personal experience, the lessons that I've learned along the way, and just put a bit more flesh on the bones for the story that I'm sure some of you will have heard already. So, it's Mental Health Awareness Week, which is a week that I normally don't engage with too much, because I really do want to put out the message that as a society in the Western world, we should not be focusing 1 week of our attention on mental health. We should be focusing on it 365 days a year. But that sounds like quite a cynical thing to say, because there is still progress to be made where that is the case. So as there's positive conversation going on this week, as there is a focus in society on talking about it this time round, I'm going to do what I haven't necessarily done before and put a bit more flesh on the bones to the story that I'm sure a lot of you will have already heard. I've shared my story plenty of times before, and if you've heard it before, you're probably sick and tired of hearing it at this point. But given that there's a fair few new people that might have heard a superficial overview of my personal experience from the Roman Kemp documentary or from some of the things that I've been up to recently, I thought putting a bit more flesh on the bones, a bit more context and a bit more background on my personal story might be a good thing to do, because I'm hoping that some people might be able to resonate with elements of it, might be able to reflect on it in a certain way, and it might allow some of the perspectives that I had when I was suffering to not be perceived in such a way for those that might be suffering now. So there's no real agenda that I've got lined up for this. I don't have any notes in front of me. This is going to be very ad hoc, so apologies if I ramble at any point, but I thought I'd just unload from my own mind and see where we end up, because as I've said, I've told this story many times before, but every time I have a meaningful conversation with somebody around it, it does open up new elements for me as an individual. So this is a valuable thing for me to do, and I hope that it's a valuable thing for those listening, because it's never easy to share. There's always elements that make me more emotional than others, but I know the value of sharing this experience. And what I would say at this stage is, if anyone has a experience with mental health that they're happy to share, but might not feel comfortable doing so, it's something that I definitely try and work towards doing, because the power of sharing your experience with those around you, whether that's your immediate social circle or otherwise, is enormous. It's the most liberating, most powerful thing I've ever done, and that's why I continue to do it, because I've seen firsthand how much resonance people can find in your story. And the key understanding is that we're not unique, weird, or a freak for feeling the way that we do, and that there's hundreds, if not thousands, of people out there feeling the same way that we do. So without wanting to sound morbid, the solidarity in suffering is what helps a lot of people figure out that they're not alone, and helps them find a way out of the other side. So without wanting to get too preachy, without wanting to sound like I'm trying to sell you something, without wanting to reflect before having actually told the story, I thought I would dive straight into a bit more context around how I've got to where I've got to, my personal experience, and apparently the neighbour's dog barking. So if that continues, I apologise, but let's crack on. So I think the best place to start is with a series of concussions that I suffered when I was 17. So I was a very keen rugby player. It formed my community, formed my sense of purpose. It gave me an outlet for the day-to-day stresses of a teenage existence, which, as we'll know, can be full of ups and downs. But I had 3 concussions in 4 weeks, which basically put me on the back foot, where I was told that I would not be able to play any contact sport for the foreseeable future. And To rewind a little bit, I'd grown up playing a variety of sports at different levels. I'd always enjoyed trying new things. I'd always enjoyed dipping my toe in this, that and the other, and then sticking with what I enjoyed. And whether that was golf, whether that was cricket, whether it was rugby, skateboarding was a huge part of my life. But I just enjoyed movement. I just enjoyed doing different things. And I was lucky enough to have a loving family that was happy for me to try all these things, was always driving me to the skate park in the evenings or taking me to cricket and rugby matches at the weekend. And something I'm very, very fortunate to have had. And I'll touch on that again later on, because those feelings of privilege, those feelings of being fortunate for having the upbringing that I did, was something that actually manifested themselves in a very negative way when I was suffering from depression. But for context purposes, I had a varied background where I found my calling in sport, in community, in that sense of purpose, that sense of common goal. And when I was 17, that was quickly taken away from me because I was told that was it. No more, I'm afraid. So I could still play cricket, I could still play golf, but rugby was the sport where I really found my tribe, found my calling, as it were. But I quickly pivoted and found the love for solo health and fitness that I'm probably better known for these days. But that's not something that came particularly naturally to begin with, because my sole intention was just to keep training as if I was a rugby player. And I quickly found this new love for the metric system of those quick rewards, that quick success that health and fitness gave me. It gave me, if you work hard this week, you might be able to lift a little bit more next week. If you run a bit faster this week, you might be able to run a little bit faster the next week. And that was something that I really, really learned to enjoy. And just to set the scene a bit more from the perspective of me as an individual, I was an interesting child. I think my parents will use a different word to describe me, but for the majority of my younger years, I was a perfectly normal kid. Grew up in Edinburgh, had a loving family, and still have a brother that's 5 years younger than me. So we got on, always have done, never had any sort of falling out, still to this day, which is incredible, because we do like to take the piss out of one another quite significantly and quite brutally at points. But nonetheless, I say again, very fortunate to have a really, really wonderful upbringing, loving family, parents still together, all these amazing things that I count myself very lucky to have. And I found myself at the age of about 13, 14, falling in with a crowd where I became quite impressionable, became a little bit misled, and started to not put any effort in at school at all, started to become a bit aggravated, a bit aggressive, and a bit angry towards my family, and just very, very non-grateful for this privileged existence that I found myself in. And that steadily got worse and worse over the years, where for a few years I'd just call myself a bit of a dick, if I'm honest. I was not kind to my parents. I was not particularly hard-working, to the point where I was disrespectful to the time and effort that my parents were putting into trying to encourage my learning, etc. And I found myself just having less and less of a fervour for doing anything other than just sort of dicking around or playing Modern Warfare 2, which is something that some listeners might be able to resonate with. But ultimately it got to the point where I was falling asleep in lessons, I was paying absolutely zero attention, and my teachers were getting very, very frustrated with me and with my parents because I was not doing what I was capable of doing. And this wasn't something that at the age of 14, 15 I had a concept of, because I just thought, oh, this is boring, this is dull, I don't have any intentions of doing anything with any of this, so it doesn't matter. Which is standard for a teenager in some senses, I think. But what I quickly realised was this wasn't necessarily who I was, and I'd just been influenced by my environment and by the people around me. So it actually got to the point where my behaviour in school was so poor that it was looking like I was going to be asked to go elsewhere. So my parents preempted that decision and moved me to a different school, which I think was probably the most positive thing that could have happened to me, because I went from bigger class sizes to much smaller class sizes and was treated as much more of an individual than a number on a piece of paper. And I think the fresh start, the fresh environment, the fresh surroundings gave me a sense of purpose that I had been missing up until that point. And it was also the age where I started to feel a bit more sense of maturity and a bit more sense of responsibility for this upbringing, this environment that I had in front of me. And rather than just throwing it away and acting like a troubled teenager who had all these problems in the world that were entirely insignificant, I started to learn how to learn, as it were, and went from a child that was probably never even going to finish his GCSEs to doing much better than anybody expected in them, which is something I'm still very proud of. But that came as a result of learning to learn that process. Rugby became really quite pivotal in my life. I found this amazing group of friends at this second school, and I'm still very, very good friends with a lot of them now. So I found that once certain elements of my life slotted into place, I was then much more in control of other elements. And this is something that I've carried with me forwards, and I think it's something that we can all learn a bit from. But I now know that there are certain elements to my life, whether it's social, whether it's educational, whether it's sporting, whether it's other relationships. There are certain things that I need to do for all of those pillars of my life to keep them ticking forwards and keeping them positive, which means that all things are moving forwards. And if one of them starts to slip down, I will over-index on that to recover that, because I know that if one thing completely falls down, I start to struggle elsewhere. So that's more of a personal reflection. But nonetheless, I found myself going into the sixth form with a real firework up my arse to just do everything I could to be the best version of myself, somewhat from a place of guilt, because I knew that I hadn't been the best son, the best friend, the best person for the past couple of years. And I thought, you know what, you've learned how to learn, you've shown that you're capable of some things, let's keep this up. And started the year with rugby being one of those pillars, and then that quickly changed as a result of those concussions that I discussed. But once I found the solo health and fitness pursuit, I really started to find a way to keep every element of my life in control. And at the age of 17, I was living almost the podcast-focused life that a lot of people talk about and have popularised recently, where I knew the value of habits, I knew the value of getting up at the same time every day and making my bed and having the same breakfast and tracking my calories and all these things, and I became very obsessive with it, to the point where I think I started to suffer with a semi-unknown eating disorder called orthorexia nervosa, which is basically where you become so regimented and dogmatic about the things that you eat or allow yourself to eat that it becomes very antisocial and very psychologically traumatic for you to be in situations. So I at the age of 17, wasn't drinking, which in Scotland is a normal thing to be doing at that age. Probably sounds mental to Americans to be saying that, but anyway, cat's out the bag, sorry mum. And didn't do that until I was about 18 and a half, 19. So I went through a long period of not really drinking for the sake of my overall physique, my overall health, my overall well-being, because I just thought, nope, it's not making you a better person, cut it out. Diligently tracking calories to the point where I had a set of scales in my jacket pocket going into the lunch hall, which is a bit ridiculous upon reflection, but I was completely sold on this reward system that I found in health and fitness, in strength and aerobic work, and I really enjoyed it. And that then made me a better student, made me better at learning, and gave me this real passion for improvement, for self-improvement, and for just chasing down these things that people didn't once expect of me, I guess. So my sole intention became getting into Oxford, and I did absolutely everything that I could, and I still don't think I could have done any more back then to have given myself the best chance of that. And I wanted to study English literature, but I took a tactical decision to reduce my chances of getting in from 3,000 to 1 to 71 to 1, and chose to study theology and religion as my application. Long story short, I didn't get an interview. My dad turned up at my door with the rejection letter in his hand, and I burst into tears because it was the first real knock that I'd had where I'd felt like I'd gone backwards, having found this new sense of purpose in my learning, in my health and fitness, and in this new chapter of being Fergus. So I sort of moped around for a little bit and then thought, you know what, you're still going to a great uni in Durham. Just work as hard as you can and just really do everything you can whilst you're there, and you'll be able to make up for this loss later in life. And you know what's fascinating is I was thinking about this as if the best university was the only possible way to succeed in life. Going to the best version of what you could achieve within this channel that schools and the regular education system lays out for us was the only way that I could be the best version of myself and be successful, when in reality, what I should have done was study sports science at Loughborough, or study sports science at a university or a city that I enjoyed, because that would have made me happy. That would have brought out the best in me. But I was led down this path of potentially being an academic statistic for the school, which meant that I fell into the trap of believing that was the right thing for me to do. And that's not a criticism of the school per se, but it's more a criticism of the education system and the broader way in which we conceive society's success. And I think we're starting to move away from that in some ways, but as a young man, my concept of the rest of my life was dictated to me by how successful I could be in the exams in front of me, in the university that I went to, in the universities that I then face, in the university exams I then face, in the graduate job that I'd then get, and then everything that came after that. Whereas to me, success now means something very different, and we'll come back to that. But I ended up going to Durham, and hadn't actually been to visit the city before, which for any university prospect students is not something I'd recommend. I'd definitely shop around before you make your decision. But my logic, as I've said, was purely go to the best university that you can, not the one that you want to go to, because of that metric system for success that I've just mentioned. And I found myself in a self-catering college by choice because, as I mentioned, I was very, very focused on my health and fitness, my nutrition, to the point where I actually qualified as a personal trainer while still at school, because it was just the way that I wanted to further my development. But anyone that's done a Reps Level 3 qualification course in the UK will know that it doesn't do much to actually help develop you, but that's an entirely separate discussion and probably an entirely separate podcast, which we'll save for another date. So moving on, I was in the self-catering college, and the college system at Durham, to some degree, I don't want to generalise, but to some degree has a sense of personality attached to the colleges within the university, and the college almost becomes your university within a university. And I didn't realise this. I just assumed that it was a halls of residence and not much else, and that the university would interact across the board. But I quickly found myself a little bit aware that I wasn't surrounded by like-minded individuals. Don't get me wrong, lovely, lovely people. I remember everyone that I met there fondly, but I just knew very quickly that they weren't going to be friends for life. We didn't have many mutual interests, and because I was quite a rigid and dogmatic person at this point, I almost ruled it out and thought, no, nothing in common, this, that and the other, move on, and then thought, oh, well, there's no one to move on to. Because I was competing in an individual sport at this point, I'd sort of translated my health and fitness goals into specifically powerlifting, having met Andy Smith, one of my good friends, who sort of converted me to just solely focusing on strength sports. There was no facility for strength sports at Durham. I tried to start one, but was told in no uncertain terms there was no space. And then the year after I left, they started one, which is a bit frustrating, but it was a good thing that it was created after I left. But I was disappointed that I didn't have access to one whilst I was there. And because I was doing a course, or a sort of subject that I didn't necessarily love, but had chosen for tactical reasons, I wasn't particularly surrounded by like-minded people there either. And credit to the community within theology, about 75% of the course were all really passionate Scripture Union members, and that's an amazing thing because they've all got their sense of community there. But that was their life outside of the subject, and I didn't belong in that way because I'm not religious in any monotheistic sense, but I almost became jealous of the fact that I wasn't, because I saw how much of a community these people had and how much they had in common just by being a part of that community, that it made me feel even more isolated. And there were a few people on my course that I probably could have pushed friendships with a little bit more to start with, but again, that dogmatic mentality that I had was ultimately my downfall. And within the first couple of weeks, I found myself feeling very isolated, very alone, a bit weird, a bit freakish, because actually maybe you weren't this social, outgoing person that you thought you were if you're the one without any friends. And then my friends at other universities were having great times. They'd all just got on with their flatmates like a house on fire straight away. And I thought, well, I sacrificed a lot as a young man and gave up a lot to try and do the best thing that I could based on the success metric system that I thought I was following. And here I am, the worst off out of a lot of them. And that bitterness started to manifest itself in a very unhealthy way, and I started to wish I'd done things differently, started to feel really quite hard done by, and not acknowledge the fact that ultimately I'd been dealt a hand that was less than ideal. But it wasn't a death sentence, it wasn't something that I couldn't change, something I couldn't influence, but I sat back thinking, well, this is what it is, and there's nothing you can do about that. So without wanting to give too much detail here, basically from that point onwards, which is sort of October 2014 through to May of 2016, things got steadily worse. But there's a few key points along the way that I'll fill in just for context sake and for the sake of this podcast, because it's ultimately meant to be a more detailed version of the story that I'm sure some of you already know. But I made some friends from a different college around December of 2014, and they're still friends of mine to this day, and that made me feel a lot better. But again, it then became very frustrating, because anyone that's been to university in the UK will know you sign for your house in second year alarmingly quickly. often to the detriment of those relationships once second year rolls around, because you realise you didn't know the person that well that you actually chose to live with. But most of the time it works out fine. But by the time I'd made friends, they'd all signed for a second year house. So I was faced with the choice of living alone in private halls, which, because of my ego, sense of purpose as a man and sense of self, that would just label me as a loner, label me as isolated, and label me as that weird kid that lives on his own in private halls, even though now that probably would have been the right thing to do. Or to live in Newcastle with friends from my old school. And I chose the latter because I thought I'd rather be detached from my university but living with people, because I'd felt so lonely up until that point. I didn't want to feel lonely anymore. But nobody knew that I was feeling lonely, because I didn't tell anyone that I was feeling lonely, because I thought to admit that would be to admit that actually maybe I wasn't all I thought I was, or maybe that I wasn't all that they thought I was. And my perception of showing that vulnerability was that it would make me less of a man, it would make me weak, and it would expose me as a fraud, not the person that I thought I was meant to be. And choosing to live in Newcastle was great for the first little while, because I was sort of spending time with people, I was going on nights out, but I slowly started to become aware of the fact that I felt quite, again, exposed, because I was the guy that went to Durham, that lived in Newcastle. So I was detached from my university, but equally detached from the city that I was living in, because I wasn't actually sort of a approved member of the university. So that started to manifest itself in my already quite chaotic mind at this point, and that loneliness started to manifest more and more. I started to feel weirder and weirder, more and more unique, and just more and more of a bit of an outcast. But I wasn't an outcast. I was a social person. I was a hard-working person. Why was this happening to me? And then those feelings started to manifest even more negatively, because I started to be really hard on myself, because, as I mentioned before, I'd had this privileged upbringing. My family were still together. I had a roof over my head. I had all my limbs. I could move properly, all these things. And I thought, why do you feel like this? Why do you feel like this? You are so lucky in comparison to others. People have things so much worse. Why are you moping around feeling this way all the time? And if I'm entirely honest, up until early to mid 2016, I didn't even believe in the concept of or reality of depression or mental health at any level. I thought that it was an excuse that gave people a way out of responsibility, or a way to avoid working hard. And I just thought it was a load of bollocks. And that was as a 19-year-old boy, man, whatever you want to call me. I'm still not quite sure, but I just couldn't process the fact that I was feeling this way. And then all of a sudden it started to manifest itself physically, to the point where I was getting split in half at the gym by weights that I could do with my eyes closed. I could barely eat. I could barely sleep. When I did sleep, I'd sleep for 20 hours and through alarms, and I had no energy. I had no fervour for anything in life, and I just felt more and more miserable, more and more anxious, and started pacing around the room when I was trying to work, and everything just became chaotic. Everything became erratic, and I just started to feel really, really lost, isolated, and more alone, but more and more hard on myself for feeling the way that I did, because this is not how a man should feel. This is not how somebody that has ambitions of being successful should feel. You're such a failure. You're such a letdown. And going back to the metric system that I mentioned earlier, the sort of step-by-step, exams equals university equals exams equals job equals X equals Y. The second that I strayed away from that process that I'd laid out in my mind, that roadmap for success that I'd set up for my future at a very young age, might I add, I'd start to feel like a failure, and then that was it. If I was a failure, what else was there to do? I'd failed. My logic wasn't, there's a way you can pull yourself back, right? Take the situation, rework it into something that's positive, and adapt to the situation you're in. I'd laid out a plan. It hadn't worked. I had failed. That was the way that I viewed things, and I felt unique. I felt alone. I felt like a freak in the corner. I felt like a social outcast, and things just became miserable, like really, really miserable. And it's it makes me a bit emotional thinking about it, because it's not a pain or an existence that I'd wish on my worst enemy. And there's some people out there that I don't love, don't have that much care for, but I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. And the timing and the actual context around the the peak of my depression is a bit blurry because it was all such a stressful period of time, but I remember that a week had passed by where I hadn't said a word out loud to another human being other than a cashier or a barista or train conductor or something like that, because we'd entered exam period. My flatmates were all doing that strange thing that university students do where they work through the night and sleep during the day for some reason, because caffeine and Monster Energy drinks at 10 p.m. seem to be the done thing there. But it meant that I wasn't seeing anyone day to day. I wasn't conversing with anyone day to day. I was going to the gym on my own. I wasn't speaking to anyone at the gym. I wasn't interacting with anyone at Durham. I only had 2 contact days a week, and I'd stopped going because I just became fearful of entering my university town out of fear of being, oh, there's that guy that went to Newcastle, what a weirdo. And I think at this point you can probably understand how much I perpetuated my own situation in my own head. People weren't standing there pointing and being like, oh, there's the weirdo that lives in Newcastle. People won't have cared. But in my own head, things became so much worse because I'd never, ever had this conversation with someone, and that's something I'll come back to. But ultimately, my own perception of masculinity, my own perception of myself, and my own perception of the stigma around mental health was what led me to, ultimately, after that week of not having a conversation with anyone for over a week, I attempted suicide in May of 2016, and I swallowed as many pills as I could get my hands on from a variety of sources, whatever you want to call them, drank about a litre of spirit, and just hoped to not wake up. And one of the things that really fascinated me about my conversation with Roman, and as I mentioned before, one of the things that makes these introspective reflections so valuable for me is that Roman asked me what my purpose and my intention had been at that moment. And I hadn't really thought about it since 2016, and I didn't consciously choose to die. I just wanted some peace. I couldn't take the white noise and the chaos inside my head anymore, and whilst deep down I will have known what my intentions were, my primary aim was peace. And then everything beyond peace I managed to repress, because I'd become so good at repressing these feelings and hiding them from the real world that I'd become very good at hiding them from myself as well. And putting on a brave face is exhausting. Putting on a smile when inside you're in turmoil is exhausting, and it wore me out. And it wore me out because I was fearful of being perceived in a certain way, of being perceived as less of a man, as vulnerable, as exposed, as weak, as a failure, as all these things that I've mentioned time and time again. But at the end of the day, I was lying there, having come around in a puddle of my own vomit, hearing my flatmates walk up and down the stairs outside my door as they were leaving the house. And my first feeling was one of anger, because my initiative had led me to a suicide attempt. The one action that I had taken to make myself feel better, quote unquote, was a suicide attempt, and that hadn't worked. So in my head, I felt like more of a failure at that moment than I ever had done before. And a few hours had passed, and I started to process the reality of this situation, and realise that this was a desperate position to be in, and not one I could get out of on my own, because that hadn't been working, clearly. And then it took me a fair while before I could properly move again. I mean, even getting my eyes to move or breathing was difficult, because I was highly, highly intoxicated from a variety of things. And by the time I could start moving again and start walking around again, and all these feelings started coming back to me, where I just started feeling chaotic in my own head, and I just wanted that peace again. I wanted that peace again. And then I managed to sleep. I slept for a long, long time. I don't know how long it was, but it was a while. I mean, there was things in my system that obviously made it so, but I woke up and it felt like a dream. It felt as if it hadn't happened, but then I looked to the right. There was the scene of what had happened, the reality that it wasn't a dream, and that actually I'd got to the point where things had been that desperate that was what I'd turned to. I got a message from Andy, who I've mentioned already so far, saying, "I'm getting a puppy from this litter next week, you in?" Fully taking the piss, fully not expecting me to say yes. On the student loan budget, he probably didn't know where the funds were coming from. But in the back of my mind, the second he said that, I thought, yes, absolutely, that is what I need. I need that. And I don't know what the first thing or what the principal point that made me realise that was, but I think at the end of the day, it was a heartbeat. It was a companion. It was someone to share my existence with, and that's something that I felt like I hadn't had for a couple of years. But most importantly, still at this point, still having come out of the back of a suicide attempt, I was afraid or wasn't comfortable talking about the reality of the situation. And if I got a dog, I could share my experience with them, but nobody would know. Well, nobody that could talk back would know. He gets close sometimes, but he's never quite managed. So a week later, I had a 14-week-old French bulldog in my arms. And overnight, I had a sense of responsibility, a sense of purpose, a reason to wake up in the morning, a reason to be alive because I was responsible for the life of another. And what was amazing was, within the first couple of weeks of having OD, just talking to people on the street about this 14-week-old French bulldog, because funnily enough, if you've got a puppy in the northeast, people will talk to you. And it wasn't like I was standing there being like, oh yeah, I've actually had a really tough time, this, that and the other. They were just asking, how's he getting on? Is he toilet trained? Or what's he like? Oh, how old is he? All this stuff. And I was just so happy to be talking to people again, just so happy. And that slowly but surely gave me a bit of a stride in my step, a bit of a sort of skip in my step, and a bit of a sense of purpose back again, and I could slowly smile. I realised I was out walking OD, and I was smiling, and I thought, wow, this is. It felt new. I mean, it wasn't new; it was just dormant, but it felt really alien to me. And we were walking in Jesmond Dean one day, which is a lovely little sort of, not nature reserve. That sounds like I'm bigging it up a bit much, but just a very pleasant little part of Jesmond in Newcastle. And I had OD off the lead because he was too scared to run away from me at this point, little wimp. But I just started saying things like, we're going to be okay, aren't we, Peg? And when I said that, I sort of took a step back and thought, oh, maybe it's going to be okay. And I thought, well, okay, things aren't okay. There you go, you've said that for the first time. And what I was doing was I was vocalizing the things that I'd repressed for so long for the first time. And what that allowed me to do is it allowed me to start to understand the actual reality and the breakdown of how I'd got to where I did. And that allowed me to reclaim a sense of myself. And then that summer, I worked a bar job in Edinburgh. I was around my friends in Edinburgh, and I just felt like I could be happy again. I just felt like I could be myself, and all this fear, all this chaos, all this fear of being an outsider, fear of being exposed was gone, because I had someone to share my existence with, and they helped me process things better for myself. They just so happen to be a dog, but the bigger message here isn't go and buy a dog if you feel depressed, but it's to share it with somebody that can help you understand it yourself. And in fact, humans are much more useful than dogs are for this, because they can actually help reflect and understand it themselves and listen and talk back. But I was so stuck in that perpetual stigma attachment that a dog was the first thing that I was willing to share with, because I still felt that I was exposed, I would be weak, I would be labelled a failure, all these things. And then Christmas of 2016 rolled around, and my mum had never wanted a dog. And yet here we were at Christmas time, and there was a dog in the house, and the conversation came up as to I'd kind of undercut them, I'd done this, and this was a bit cheeky of me, and I mean, it was a bit more aggressive than that. Not aggressive, wrong word, sorry mum. But the conversation came up in quite a frank manner, and I had to just say, look, you know what, there's a reason he's here, and this is why, and there it was. I'd told my family, I'd told people, human beings, what had happened, the experience that I'd had, and that was the most liberating thing that I'd done for myself at that point, because it meant that it was out in the world, they were understanding, they didn't view me any differently, they just wanted to help and they wanted to support me. And what's terrifying and what's really scary now is that they were always there to help and they were always there to support me. But the barrier to that was me, not them. I pushed away the support network that I was lucky enough to have out of fear of undermining the perception of masculinity and myself that I had in my own head. But I became a better version of myself, a better version of my masculine self, I guess, once I shared that with them and once I shared that experience with them. Because it allowed me to be myself and to actually not repress these thoughts, not repress these feelings, and it freed me from the shackles of my own shame, I guess. And it allowed me to start to live my life and be happy again, and just that's it. I was being happy again, which was an amazing thing. And from that point onwards, third year was great. I lived with the people that I mentioned earlier that I made friends with in December, Charlie, Tom and Tom. We lived together in third year in the centre of Durham with Odie, the pig dog, kicking about the house as well, and I had a fantastic time. Having a French bulldog in third year has pros and cons, but honestly, the amount of credit and the amount of power that just being with those guys and having a sense of tribe, community and friendship again, it just did so much for me. It really brought me back to feeling like I could get on with the rest of my life and this wasn't going to be what defined me. And it also made me realise that I'd gone through this experience, but I wasn't down and out. I could still be myself. I could still be perceived in a certain way. I could still act in a certain way, and I could still make progress as a human being. And I don't think I've ever really thanked those three enough formally for how much of an impact it had. But yeah, sorry, bit emotional, but third year was a real turning point for me because it allowed me to really reclaim a sense of who I was and that everything was going to be okay. And I got there because I had people around me that I could trust and that would listen. And I didn't actually explain to them what had happened, but that was because I'd processed it enough in my own head that just being around people and just engaging with those that didn't make me feel unique or isolated or a freak was all I needed to reclaim some sense of self. And I ended up in London 2 days after my graduation, actually, so shortest summer holiday ever. I was doing Heineken UK's graduate scheme and went from there into a full-time role with them, and not long after I started that, I found myself in a coffee shop in Brixton where I was settling down for a day's work, and I was caught amidst a policy change between wholesale and direct supply, which is irrelevant information, but nonetheless, I was caught in the middle of a policy change which made it very difficult for me to do my job effectively. And I opened my laptop and I just got hit with this overwhelming white noise and overwhelming frustration, which I realised was me slipping back into a sense of depression. And my first thought was, oh God, right, okay, smile, carry on, get on with it. But then I thought, no. Close the laptop, take a second, reflect on why you're feeling this way. I nearly rolled my R's there. Most Scottish thing I've done today. And try and find a solution. So I thought, right, okay, what were you missing last time you felt like this way? A sense of purpose, a sense of fulfillment, a sense of community. How can you find that? Is that the way you're feeling now? To some degree, yes. I had a sense of community, I had friends, I had a flatmate, I had plenty of stuff going on in London that was great, so I thought, okay, it's not that. It's a sense of fulfillment. I'm missing a purpose. I don't feel like I'm doing the best thing for me that I can be doing at the moment, so I thought, what am I good at? I'm good at squatting. I was still competing sort of at a decent level in powerlifting, and thought, okay, good at squatting. Charity, what's out there? Okay, Movember, moustache, good conversation point, that's nice. Rugby, been a part of it in the past, got cult status, that's kind of cool. Oh, and Movember do a lot of stuff for men's mental health and suicide prevention, that's good, I can talk about that. And then I sat there and thought, okay, there's something here. And I came out of that afternoon, I mean, it wasn't a very productive day's work for Heineken, apologies if any of my previous employers are listening, but I took that moment to figure out how best to move forwards, and I came up with a plan of trying to squat 500,000 kilos in 24 hours to represent the 500,000 male suicides around the world every year for Movember. Obviously, as you do, that's where people's minds go, isn't it? And at that point, I announced online, right, I'm doing this thing. I contacted Movember, and I just suddenly had this real buzz, this real energy to get something done, to really do what was going to make me happy again. And I put it out there on my personal Facebook, my small individual circles, just saying, look, I'm doing this for men's mental health and suicide prevention. I didn't say I've suffered. I didn't say this is a very deeply personal experience for me. I just said, I'm doing this for this. If you're keen to support in any way, please do. And I was flooded with really positive, really supportive messages from my immediate friendship group, my immediate social circle, and my broader social circle, people I hadn't spoken to in years, all saying, wow, this is a great thing to be doing for that cause. It's something that definitely needs more attention. And I sensed an undertone of desperation in a lot of these messages, in that I'm so glad somebody's doing something about this because I feel it needs to be done. And I thought, maybe I wasn't the weird one after all. Maybe none of us are weird. Maybe this is just a part of being a human being and a part of who we are. And I spoke to my parents and I spoke to Movember, and I said, look, I think I'm comfortable sharing this with the world. And they were so supportive, both parties, and helped me craft a way of doing it without it being too punchy or dramatic or anything like that. Because I didn't want it. The project was never about me. It was about this cause that had become incredibly meaningful to me, and a way of vocalizing the mistakes that I'd made as a way of trying to hope others wouldn't make them. And look, I'm going to be honest, I was terrified when I put out a Facebook post explaining the reality of why I was doing what I was doing, and I sent a WhatsApp message to my sort of immediate friendship group, just bluntly saying, here's this press release that's going out. I was really scared of how it would be received, really scared. Even though I was comfortable with it myself, this was a whole different step. And within 24 hours having sent it out, I've never been more confident in a decision that I've made in my entire life. It was the most liberating thing I've ever done, and I'll stand by that, and I can't imagine anything will ever feel more liberating than that, in terms of taking a weight off my shoulders, freeing me from the shackles of my past, and allowing me to really become the best version of myself moving forwards. And once that was out there, it was out there. And immediately these people that had been messaging me beforehand saying, oh, I'm so glad you're doing this, started giving me a bit more information about why it was so important to them. And then I started having these conversations with people that I hadn't spoken to for years, these big masculine rugby players, these military personnel, all these people that in my mind were the epitome of men. And then here I was, a man who was terrified of failure, a man who's terrified of discussing these things at any level for years and years, to the point where it almost ended my life, having a conversation with other men who felt the same way. And for the first week of that campaign, I was just crying all the time, because it was a mix of fear, liberation, and pride, in the sense that I'd been so wrong, but it meant that I never needed to feel that way again. I never needed to feel so viciously, perpetually depressed, because I knew that I didn't need to get to the stage that I let myself get to in the past, because people were out there to help, and I wasn't the freak that I thought I was. And since then, a lot's happened. I've gone through 3 significant Movember campaigns. I've raised almost £100,000 for the cause, and that's something I'm very proud of, but I'm very keen that it's never about me, because I don't want it to be. It's not. My story is simply what I hope to be a catalyst for other people to not make the mistakes that I did, which are to distill them down, to think that you're unique in your situation, because you're not. You're just another human being whose wants, desires, needs aren't being fulfilled in the way that they should be. That you don't have access to support. We all have access to support, whether that's in the form of family or friends, if we're lucky enough to have both of those things. But if not, there are hotline support networks out there that are very accessible and very supportive. There's been a huge discussion in society on this in the past couple of years. There's a lot to be done, and there's going to be a lot of bullshit on social media this week that is going to do more damage than good. But amongst that, there's going to be a lot of positive reinforcement around the fact that we're making huge strides towards a better world for this. And that's something I'm very proud to be a part of. It's something I'm very proud to witness, and it's something I'm not afraid to consistently bring up, which is why sharing this story again is something that I feel people will probably roll their eyes at, being, oh, he's milking it, he's doing this, doing all that. But no, my intention is purely to try and highlight my own mistakes, because I know how damaging they were for me, in the hope that you, someone else, someone close to you, doesn't need to make those mistakes, because I've made them for you, as it were. And the third mistake, and the most significant mistake that I made, was that I didn't talk. I didn't share in my experience. I didn't even acknowledge internally my experience, and I cut myself off at the knees by not sharing the feelings that I was having with those around me, even though I had access to them, as I've mentioned, in those support networks. So My mistakes don't need to be yours. My mistakes don't need to be anyone else's. I appreciate that saying that is much easier said than done, and that sharing your story can be an incredibly existentially terrifying thing to do, but I've been there. I've been as bad as this can get. My concept of a man is much simpler now than it was then, and I think it just comes down to personal responsibility and being responsible for those around you, and beyond that, nobody gets to decide what makes you, you, other than you. And that's something that doesn't just apply to men, it applies to all of us. And society wants you to follow certain paths. I fell into that trap once before. I've broken out of that cycle through a very negative experience, but again, that experience makes me who I am today. And it's not something I wear as a badge of honour per se, but it's not something I'm afraid to talk about. I'd happily meet Gaz from down the pub and meet him for 15 seconds and happily share with him that I suffered from depression and attempted suicide. And so the aim of this here was just to put a bit of flesh on the bones in terms of the story that I'm sure most of you will have already heard, and I hope that I've done that without just rehashing the same old stuff again and again. But if that is the case, sorry to have wasted your time, but if it's not, then I do hope that there's some certain elements of this that you can take away. And I don't want to give too many lessons, I don't want to preach too much around what you should be doing, because at the end of the day, mental health is very individual. Painting it with a broad brushstroke is not something that's easily done, and there's a lot of stuff out there on the internet, on social media, that is far from helpful on this, and nobody has the answers for society yet. I don't think we'll ever find the answers for society yet, but that's down to the fact that it's a very, very individual process, and we need to reframe the way in which we consider it as part of our overall well-being rather than something that we have or we don't. Because too often these days I'm hearing people say things like they suffer from mental health, or I'm lucky I don't have mental health. That language distinction is important to make, because I think it helps us understand that we all have mental health, but we don't all have mental illness in the same way that, I mean, it's a sliding scale. You have healthy mental health, or you have unhealthy mental health, in the same way that you have good physical health or you have bad physical health. And things we can do, like eating a nutrition dense diet, will put us on the side of good physical health, whereas there's things that we can do for our own mental health that will help us consume better things, do better things to make us have a more positive relationship with our own minds. So without wanting to get preachy or sounding like I'm trying to sell you something or give you lots of information to take away that I quite frankly don't have any right to be giving you, I just want you to consider the position that I was in, the mistakes that I made, how they might manifest into your own life, how they might manifest into the lives of those close to you, where the reflections might be, how it might be similar to certain experiences you've had or heard of, and how you can carry this conversation forward. If you've got a story to share and haven't yet shared it, I appreciate it's a very, very difficult thing to do, but please take confidence in the power of doing so, whether it's something you do tomorrow or a couple of years from now. It could be something that changes someone's life for the better, and that's an opportunity that's a beautiful thing, and something I've been very, very lucky to have the privilege of doing on different stages. So Mental Health Awareness Week is about exactly that. It's about awareness, but I think it's much more important than that. I think it's about action. We all have seen loads and loads of stuff, loads of media about mental health, so I think awareness is done. We know it's there. We know it exists. We know it's a prevalent part of society. We know it's something that is being taken seriously, whether that is from a box ticking point of view or from an actual meaningful point of view is yet to be determined. But mental health is a conversation in society, conceptually. The conversations around individual, personal, meaningful mental health still need to be developed. So if you've listened to this and you've got this far, my only challenge to you at this stage would be to have a conversation with someone on mental health this week that you might not otherwise have had, and try and continue to do that week in, week out, day in, day out as you go, whether it's colleagues, whether it's friends, whether it's family. It doesn't need to be deep, introspective, psychological analysis. It just needs to be a case of asking how someone's doing and asking them twice, because we can very, very easily default to our British stiff upper lip of, I'm fine, when in reality you might not be fine. I did it for 2 years and it nearly was the death of me. So again, I'm using myself as an example for no reason other than the sake of this story, because I'm far from an example that we should all look to, but I'm just another example of a young man who had a terrible perspective on who he was, where he was going, what he should do to belong in society. And I've made mistakes that I've learnt from, and I'm sharing them in the hope that others don't need to, quite simply. So if you do engage with this podcast in a positive way, I'd love to hear from you. If there's anything that you're happy to share and don't feel confident doing so with anyone, but might feel like you can share with me, please do it. I will do my best to get back to you in some detail. And beyond that, just try and have more positive conversations on this stuff. It doesn't need to be massively deep, analytical. It just needs to be consistent. Let people close to you know that you're there for them. Let people know that you can be relied upon in a time of crisis, and make yourself available if somebody close to you ever is in a time of crisis. And if you don't feel like you've got people close to you that you can rely upon, there are plenty of resources out there that you can access. I will be posting some on my personal Instagram over the next couple of days for the UK. So if you're over in the States, I apologise, but there are plenty of resources out there that are available. But I do hope you've enjoyed this. I hope for those that have heard my story before, it hasn't just seemed like a rehashing of the same old stuff. I thought I'd try and share this in the hope that I can put a bit more context around my story, because I know that context is king with this sort of thing. And ultimately the context of my situation was what made me feel quite unique, when in reality, if you boil it down, I was just very simply a lonely human being who was doing the wrong things. Simple as that. But not to trivialise it in any way, there's a big crisis in the UK that we need to address, and we need to address it seriously. Mental Health Awareness Week isn't enough to address it seriously, quite frankly. And I normally don't engage with weeks like this, as I've said, because I feel that it's insulting and a bit tenuous to devote a week to something that is, quite frankly, as prevalent a part of our lives as anything else is. But nonetheless, it encourages positive conversation, which is what I'm all about. So do exactly that. Have those positive conversations. But at this point, I'm rambling. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say goodbye. I'm going to say thank you for listening. And I'm going to say once more, if you do have any positive engagements off the back of this, or anything you want to share with me personally, please do reach out on social media at Fergus Crawley. Other than that, please do listen in on previous episodes, as there are some important discussions on mental health in there as well, especially number 1 with Roman Kemp, where we actually dissect the conversations and the lessons learned from our silent emergency. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you again. Speak soon.